Well, we're at time, so I guess we could probably get started. Good morning, everyone. This is February 28th, 2021. This is the Faith and Function class. You are being recorded. Hi, everybody. You're being recorded. This gets posted on YouTube. And the teacher today is Steve McKenzie. Go for it, Judy.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. Before I open us with prayer, I just wanted to see if there was any concerns or celebrations that anyone wants to mention. Yes, Rick.
Please remember my parents. As y'all will probably know by now, they've been in assisted living locked up for a year. My dad fell and broke his hip on Monday, and my mom, who has advanced dementia, has been going out of, how do I say it? Making like 15 phone calls in a 2-hour period, wondering where he is. And it's been a tough week, and it will be. So prayers are welcome.
For sure. All right, let's bow our heads in prayer. Holy God, we are grateful this morning for this opportunity to gather and to learn from your word. We ask that you grant us open and receptive minds and hearts as we study together, and may what we learn today bear fruit in our lives to your greater glory. Lord, we remember before you today those known to us who need your care and blessing. Terry Bishop and his wife Carol, and Rick Baker and his parents. We also celebrate and thank you for our new pastor, David Powers. These things we ask in the name and for the sake of Jesus Christ, our Savior. Amen. Okay, well, our teacher this morning is Dr. Steve McKenzie, and Steve is well known to us in the Faith and Function class because he's taught us on a number of occasions. But I think it's worthwhile for us to review his many achievements and credentials from time to time so that we can be reminded of our good fortune in having him share with us today and for the next 2 Sundays. Steve is professor of Hebrew Bible and Old Testament at Rhodes College. His research and teaching interests include the history of ancient Israel, the literature of the Hebrew Bible, Hebrew language and grammar, the Dead Sea Scrolls, methods of biblical interpretation, and archaeology. He is a past president of the Board of Governors at the Institute of Egyptian Art and Archaeology at the University of Memphis. And he worked for 10 years with the Middle East Travel Seminar, leading academic tours of Syria, Jordan, the Sinai, Israel, and Greece. He founded with Richard D. Nelson the Deuteronomy history section at the Society of Biblical Literature annual meeting, and has served on numerous editorial boards, including the Journal of Biblical Literature and the Catholic Biblical Quarterly. From 2010 through 2019, he was associate editor of Vetus Testamentum. He has appeared on the Discovery and History channels and in radio interviews as a consultant on King David and on reading and interpreting the Bible. Currently, he's serving as a main Old Testament Hebrew Bible editor for the Encyclopedia of the Bible and its reception. He is Hebrew Bible Old Testament editor for the Oxford Bible Commentary series and for the HarperCollins Study Bible, and editor of the Oxford King James Annotated Bible. And this spring, Steve and 2 of his colleagues at Rhodes are coming out with a new commentary on the book of Jonah. So we are privileged indeed to have Steve with us, and we want to welcome him here today.
Thank you, Judy. It's good to see you all, sort of, again. And I was, as I look at myself on the screen, and this comment relates only to me, not to anybody else, but I have noticed that this is I never even bother to look in a mirror anymore. This is the only time I actually see what I look like. And I remember going to Faith and Function and people showing up in sort of formal dress and suits and ties, and me as well. And I think the last time I did the Faith and Function class, maybe last fall or whenever, it was kind of that way too. And now it's, sweatshirt, whatever, pajamas, whatever I can find. So, but I'm glad to see that not all of you have fallen into that trap. So good to see you. And we'll be talking today about prophecy in the Old Testament Hebrew Bible, and then next week wisdom, and the week after that letters, New Testament letters or epistles. So since I can't see most of you, just speak up and interrupt if you have any questions or comments, and I'll try to leave some time also at the end. All right, so let's talk about just some general things first of all, and maybe begin with a pet peeve that probably won't be relevant to you, but will or is at least to my students, and that is that just a bit of a review of English grammar. We have the noun, a prophet, and we have the verb to prophesy. And when you conjugate that verb, I prophesy, he prophesies, he, she, it sort of prophesies, a prophecy, but nobody ever prophesizes because there is no verb to prophesize, even though you will see it and hear it. And I realize this is a kind of toting or fighting with windmills, but that's that's my stance. So the Bible actually may have more prophets than you realize. It's a common term, of course. The Hebrew Bible has 3 parts, and they are often abbreviated and made into an acronym. So the 3 parts are the Torah, or the law, the prophets, or Naviim, and that's that second part, and then the writings, or the Ketuvim. So the prophets are actually the largest section of the Hebrew Bible, and they include basically 2 sections known as the former prophets, Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, even though not all of that material is what we might call prophecy in the same sense. And then you also have the latter prophets, which are the books that we think of more as prophetic books: Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and then the what are called the Book of the 12, or the Scroll of the 12, or the minor prophets, Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, and so on. All right, not Daniel, which is actually a different genre. It is apocalyptic. And then you have a number of other people in the Bible that are referred to as prophets, sometimes for reasons that aren't entirely clear. Abraham is called a prophet. Moses is called a prophet. There are 5 women in the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible who are called prophets: Miriam, the brother or sister of Moses; Deborah in Judges 5. There's a woman named Huldah in 2 Kings 22 at the time of Josiah. And then there is somebody who is simply called the prophetess, or the female prophet, presumably Isaiah's wife, although that's not clear, but that's what she is referred to, and usually assumed to be Isaiah's wife because she bears a child to Isaiah. So, but may have been a prophet also in her own right. And finally, a woman named Noadiah in the book of Nehemiah. And then beyond the Hebrew Bible, in the New Testament, not in the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament, but in the New Testament, David is called a prophet in reference to some of the Psalms. John the Baptist is called a prophet. In Muslim tradition, Jesus is called a prophet, and then Muhammad also is a prophet. So what we're going to talk about today is, and what I want to kind of suggest to you, it may be a bit surprising in terms of what prophets do, or what the prophets in the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible do. And basically what that is, just to sort of anticipate, is I want to suggest to you that our typical understanding of prophets as people who foretell the future is really a little bit incorrect, a little bit misleading. They do that, yes, but not in terms that we typically think of. All right, so I'll sort of fill in those details as we go. Some terminology: the word prophet itself comes from a Greek term and means one who speaks for, a spokesperson, one who speaks for a god in particular. The Hebrew term is navi, naviim, which actually means somebody who is called for a particular task. But one of the things you might notice that hard to build much of a case for this, but it is a kind of an interesting point, is that neither of these terms refers specifically to prediction. Okay, neither one of them says anything about foretelling the future, though that is certainly in part what prophets do, right? But prophets in the Bible are not like Nostradamus, that we think. Some of you all are of a certain age. You remember a kind of a craze a few years ago where everybody was talking about Nostradamus as this medieval monk who, according to his texts, predicted the future, like of the 20th or 21st century, although it was always very vague, and it always had to be interpreted, and it was really, frankly, mostly nonsense. But that was the idea. And a lot of people have that same idea about prophets in the Bible, that their main function is to predict the distant future. When in fact, in the Hebrew Bible, when prophets do talk about the future, it is a future always intimately related to the present. And if you think about it, that makes perfect sense, because when people in the Hebrew Bible in ancient Israel, the Old Testament, went to talk to prophets or people who were like prophets, the questions that they raised were always about their own lives, just as in the case of us today. If somebody goes to see, for example, a palm reader or fortune teller today, you're not interested in finding out what's going to happen in 1,000 years. You're interested in what's going to happen tomorrow or next week. So that's the case also with people in ancient Israel. Kings would consult prophets or fortune tellers or diviners, people who would deal in the future, but their interest was in, should I go to war? Should I do this? Am I going to survive this injury, this fall? Will my son survive this disease? That sort of thing. They're not interested in hearing about what's going to happen 1,000 years later, right? And this is a case where...
Steve?
Yes, please, Daniel.
Sorry. While we're talking about what the terms were in like the ancient world, the Greeks also had they had oracles, right? But that's a different word, and it's not quite the same thing.
It
And I
is.
know it's not really in the Bible anyway, but
No. It's an excellent question, Daniel. It's an excellent question because you're absolutely right. It is a different idea, a different term, but it's also something that is very much in the background of what prophets do even in the Hebrew Bible in the Old Testament. They also, in some cases, serve as oracles. And they divine and they do all those kinds of things. And again, all of that feeds into the notion of what prophets are and what prophets do. So it's certainly part of the background. You're right. But even in cases like that, the concern is always for the immediate future. And the reason why I'm kind of raising this point is because Christians in particular have adopted this idea that what prophets in the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible do is that they predict the future about Jesus. And what I want to suggest to you is that that's not really the case. We're going to look at some prophetic texts, and we're going to talk about some places in the New Testament that refer to prophecies, but that really has to do with the interpretation of the New Testament writers and not with what the people in the prophets in the Old Testament were saying. And I like to use this example too. Most of us have Jewish friends or Jewish acquaintances. And so for Christians, when Christians read the Old Testament and they read a particular passage, especially one that might be reinterpreted in the New Testament, Christians tend to think, well, here's a prophecy that's fulfilled. What's wrong with these Jewish people? Why can't they see that? Are they really so stubborn or so hard-headed or whatever? And my point is simply this: all of our friends who are Jewish, they're no more stupid or ignorant or hard-headed than anybody else. This is a matter of different interpretations at a much later perspective. Okay, so I really appreciate that question, Daniel, because we're going to see some good examples. Let me talk about some of these interpretations of things that I have in mind. All right, so there's a very famous passage in the book of Matthew that relates to the virgin birth. All this took place, Matthew 1:22, all this took place to fulfill, look at Matthew's language, to fulfill what had been spoken through the prophet. Look, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and you shall name, or they shall name him Emmanuel, which means God with us. All right. So what Matthew appears to be doing here is saying that the prophet Isaiah, he doesn't name Isaiah, but that's where this is coming from, Isaiah chapter 7, and actually it's not 7:1, it's 7:15. So at any rate, Isaiah, he's saying Isaiah predicted this long ago, okay? But there are some problems here. And one of the problems is that what Matthew quotes isn't exactly what the Hebrew reads. And that's because what Matthew is quoting is a sort of a version of, or it's closer to, the Greek translation, the Septuagint, which uses in particular this term virgin. But the Hebrew doesn't use that term. It uses a term young woman. And in the text in Isaiah itself, what the passage says is the young woman is pregnant. Already in the year 732, she's pregnant. And there is no case ever of a woman having a pregnancy that lasts 800 years. Okay, doesn't happen, didn't happen then. So what Isaiah is saying is that this woman who's already pregnant is going to have a son. Maybe that's a sort of a prediction, and she'll name him Emmanuel. But Isaiah is saying this as a sign to the king of Judah at the time. And the point of this sign is to say that by the time this child starts to grow up, reaches a certain age of just a few months, that the king of Judah is worried about being attacked by a couple of other kings. And what Isaiah is telling him is, you need to chill out and rest assured that by the time this child reaches this age in a few months, these two kings that you're so worried about now are going to be gone. There's nothing to worry about. Okay, so it's very much related to what's happening in 732. It has nothing to do initially with Jesus, but what Matthew is doing is quoting the Septuagint, the Greek version, as a way of sort of pointing out or pointing to the virgin birth of Jesus, right? Now, and there's nothing necessarily inappropriate about what Matthew is doing there. This is a typical kind of move made by Christian and Jewish interpreters in the first century. So it's a kind of interpretation that was prominent in the day. And I would also suggest that it's a kind of interpretation that we still practice in a way. Kids, my students, maybe your children, your grandchildren, talk about the practice of sampling. I never knew what that meant, but I knew what the idea was. Sampling is when a musician writes a song and then takes an earlier song and maybe uses part of that, reuses part of that, reconfigures it, okay, and maybe reinterprets it. Or to give you another example that we might be familiar with, if you go to the Civil Rights Museum downtown, you'll find, some of you may know this very well, as you're going in, you'll find a place where there is a plaque. It's actually a kind of a sculpture of an open Bible. And there's a quote there from the book of Genesis that says, when they saw him coming, they said, "Here he comes, the dreamer, let us arise and kill him." Now that's a quote from the story of Joseph in the Old Testament, in the book of Genesis. And when that story of Joseph was written, the author, I don't think, was thinking of Martin Luther King Jr. at all. But the interpretation that is kind of given, or the way that that's being used for the Civil Rights Museum is very appropriate because of Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech and so on. So it's really not a matter of prediction. It's really a matter of reinterpretation and reconfiguration. And that's what New Testament writers do. Let me give you another example. Matthew in particular likes to do this, especially because Matthew is writing for a Jewish audience, right? So people who knew the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament well, and Matthew is reinterpreting those words, and he uses the term fulfill, which is interesting, because I think what he means by that is not fulfill in the sense of prediction fulfillment, but fulfill in the sense of fill with new meaning. Give its, or perhaps give its fullest sense, something like that. All right, Matthew quotes from this passage in Hosea, This is when Jesus is taken by Jesus is less than 2 years old, and he's taken by his parents to Egypt, according to the story in Matthew, because Herod is trying to kill all the baby boys in Jerusalem. All right. And so then after a certain period of time, after Herod dies, they bring him back from Egypt. And Matthew quotes this passage. This is to fulfill what is spoken by the Lord through the prophet. Out of Egypt, I've called my son. All right. That's a quote from the book of Hosea, the prophet Hosea. But look at what Hosea says. When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. Talking about what event, obviously?
Oh, it's about the Exodus.
Yes, about the Exodus from Egypt, yeah. And using the image of Israel as God's son. Has nothing to do with Jesus. But Matthew is seeing those words, Egypt, son, etc., and reinterprets and reapplies them to Jesus in a similar way to the way that the Joseph story is being reinterpreted at the Civil Rights Museum. One more quick example, and this is a very interesting one, again from Matthew. So this is when Jesus is has come to Jerusalem, and he's getting ready to come into Jerusalem for what we sometimes call the triumphal entry, leading up to Easter, to crucifixion and resurrection. All right. So he tells a couple of his disciples to go ahead of him to a village, and that they will find a donkey and a colt. And he says, untie them and bring them to me. And so they do. And they bring them to him. And then you have Matthew saying that this is to fulfill what had been spoken through the prophet, saying, tell the daughter of Zion, look, your, what is that? Your king, sorry, is coming toward you, humble, mounted on a donkey and on a colt. Now, that's a very striking text if you look at it for a second, because first of all, if you read it carefully, it's sort of incredible what Matthew is saying here. Jesus is riding in not on one animal, but on two. It's like a circus rider. You know, he's on a donkey and a colt, both. That's, sort of shocking, striking. And you wonder why it is that Matthew has done that. And the answer is because he's quoting from Zechariah. And Zechariah, yes, does refer to two animals, a donkey and a colt. But what Zechariah is doing is phrasing this in terms of poetry. And as a poem, this is what's called in Hebrew, or in analyzing Hebrew poetry, this is what's called parallelism. And so what Matthew is really doing, or what Zechariah is doing, is using this this language, this parallel of a donkey and a colt, as a way of referring to one animal, namely a royal mount. Jesus, or the king in Zechariah's imagery, is coming in, riding as a king into Jerusalem. And this is what Jesus is being pictured as doing. But Matthew takes the prophecy, or the text of Zechariah, as a prophecy, and takes it so literally that he has Jesus come in riding on two animals, not one. Okay? All right, let me pause there and see if there are any questions or comments, and then we'll go back to Daniel's question and address this issue of the roots of prophecy. So any questions, anything that anybody would like to raise?
What's the context in Zechariah? It's one of those books that was
Context in Zechariah, no, it's a great question. The context in Zechariah is talking, he is in a sense functioning much more as a prophet in the way we tend to think of it. He's talking about the future, but what he's talking about is an idealized future when the kingdom of Judah will be restored and will actually have a king in the line of David. And what kings do in that imagery is they throw off enemies and oppressors and restore kind of the golden age as it's envisioned, as it was under David, the empire. Does that help? It's in very sort of utopian terms is what Zechariah is doing.
I just want to thank you for this, Steve, because I've been so frustrated with Matthew's use of the prophecy. And this gives me a whole new forgiving light.
Yeah, I think it sounds like like I might be sort of disrespecting Matthew or the New Testament interpreters, and I'm not doing that at all. This is part of a kind of interpretive move that was common at the time, but it's one that frankly doesn't really work in our context anymore. It's not just a matter of prediction fulfillment, or foreseeing the future. It's really reinterpretation, reuse, reimagining for a different purpose. And as we see with something like the Civil Rights Museum, again, that's understanding that that's what's going on is perfectly appropriate.
It's like a remix or something where it's
Exactly.
like, hey, these are the greatest hits, but
Yes.
take a look at this.
Yes, a remix or a reuse, because some of the words, some of the terms, some of the images speak to us in a new way. It's very interesting to me to see how this goes on particularly in popular music, because we have examples of cases where a song is reused or remixed or sampled or whatever to mean exactly the opposite of what it once did. Okay, to give you an example, I think most of us are from my generation. Creedence Clearwater Revival. The band, and maybe the song American Sun. Where it ain't me, so when that song was written, it was written as a protest against the Vietnam War. But a few years ago, you could go to high school football games during the Iraq conflict, and they would play it all the time as a political song, in favor of the action in Iraq. Exactly the opposite of the way that song was initially written for, but it was being reused. What's there's also the Bruce Springsteen song, which is
Born in the USA.
Yeah, Born in the USA. Again, used now in some ways as a kind of a positive political, pro-USA, but it wasn't. If you look at the lyrics in particular, it doesn't really support that view or that interpretation. But that's what we do. We reuse, we interpret. All right, well, let's talk about then, and again, feel free to interrupt at any time. Oops. Let's talk about then some roots of some things. And here's where I think, from my perspective, prophecy gets really interesting in terms of the kind of the question Daniel was raising. Let me figure out where I am. All right. Scoot down a little further. Sorry, kind of lost my place. All right, here we go. Roots of prophecy in the Hebrew Bible. So Daniel mentioned oracles, divination. One of the things that might be a little surprising is to recognize that we have Daniel and others precisely these same kinds of things going on in the Hebrew Bible. It's just that, or in the Old Testament, it's just that we often miss them because of the way things are translated. So for example, here's this passage in Genesis 25. This is with the birth of Jacob and Esau. And this is their mother, Rebecca, who feels the children struggling within her. Now, keep in mind in the story, she doesn't know that they're twins, but she goes and the language says she went to inquire. All right, that word inquire really means to divine. So there's a whole process behind this, and the writer doesn't fill in the details of what that might have involved, but that's what she's doing. She's divining of Yahweh to find out what's going on, somehow consulting something like an oracle, all right? Or we have, again, the Joseph story, and at one point you may remember Joseph's brothers come for grain. Joseph secretly puts his silver cup in one of their bags, in Benjamin's bag, and they take it back, and then they come back or they're brought back, and Joseph accuses them of stealing it. And look what he says: "This is my silver cup." It's not that he uses it for drinking; it's a cup he uses for divination, probably by putting in water and oil, and then using ideas at the time to try to divine the future from the configurations of the oil. Or another example, Saul later on tries to inquire, God's not answering it, but look what it says. God did not answer him by dreams or by Urim or by prophets. Urim is some of you may know the term, the Urim and Tumim, or the Urim and Thummim, probably something like flipping a coin or drawing straws. It usually would be something that, from what we can tell, that would give three possible answers: yes, no, or no answer. Okay, or by prophets, which would seem to be something again like divination. We'll talk more about maybe how prophets function in some other examples. So we have examples of dream interpretation, where Joseph, in this case, interprets dreams. Prophets do that as well. Where you have in the famous story in the book of Samuel, where Saul, before he becomes king, goes in search of his father's donkeys. And here the figure is called a seer. But then the writer goes on to tell you that the one who's now called a prophet used to be called a seer. And that term sort of implies exactly what it sounds like: seeing the future. Again, the immediate future, because in this case, what Saul wants to know is where his donkeys are, where the lost donkeys are. And what the prophet who's identified here as Samuel tells him is he says, "Come with me to the sacrifice tonight. We're going to have a banquet, basically, and you come with me to that. And then in the morning, I'll tell you where your donkeys are." Well, why does he need the morning? Because he's going to hope for a dream revelation during the night. Another thing that prophets sometimes do, I mentioned the oil and the water, divination in that sense. Sometimes they use weapons. Bellomancy, it's called, to try to answer questions about the future. We have a case of that in 2 Kings 13. Prophets use music in some stories to induce trances. All right, we have a really good example even a better one than this in the story in 2 Kings 3, where the king of Israel comes to the prophet. In this case, it's Elisha. And he has a question, should we go to war? And Elisha says, bring me a musician. And then while he's playing the musician, while the musician's playing, the Spirit of Yahweh comes upon him and he addresses the question. So prophecy, seen as having been induced by a trance, by music. You have a case where in 1 Kings 22, where the kings want to know, shall we go to war? All right. And this is a very interesting example. Let me go back to that one because it relates to Daniel's question earlier. Daniel referred to oracles, and in particular, one very famous one that you may know of, the Oracle at Delphi, where it was a complicated process. Somebody would come with a question to address the person, and then the spokesperson, and then the spokesperson would take it inside the cave. And apparently the oracle inside the cave would consult the deity, and then would give that to the spokesperson, who then would interpret it. All right. We have a very famous story where there's a king who sends to the oracle at Delphi and wants to know, should I go to war? Now, this is a Greek king. It is, in fact, his name now is...
Croesus of Lydia.
Yes, exactly. Thank you.
And he wants to fight King Cyrus.
That's right. And so Croesus, exactly. And so that's exactly right. Thank you, Daniel. And so so Croesus goes to the oracle of Delphi, and the answer that comes back is, if you go to war, a great empire will fall. And so Croesus thinks, oh, great, I'm going to go to war and I'm going to defeat my enemy. And so he goes to war. Only notice the ambiguity of that oracle, a great empire, but which great empire? And so Croesus, in fact, loses. Well, you have really the same thing in the Bible. 1 Kings 22. King of Israel wants to know, should I go to war? And the prophets gather together and they say, go up, for Yahweh will give it into the hand of the king. The question is, which king? See? And so one of the things you don't realize is that answer, that response is ambiguous. And I won't go into the whole rest of the story, which is very interesting. Just to kind of fill this out a little bit, notice that in the Moses story, you even have the term prophet used in a slightly different way, where God tells Moses, I'm giving you Aaron as your prophet. And what he means by that is not as your predictor, but as your spokesperson, your spokesman. And that really is kind of the image that becomes sort of the main thing that prophets in the Hebrew Bible do. They are spokesmen or spokeswomen for God. They are, in a sense, you can think of them really as preachers to some extent, arising from these other roots. Certainly with the idea of somehow dealing with what's going to happen. But most of the time, I should say, one of the things we don't recognize, this thus says Yahweh or thus says the Lord, that's a messenger formula. That's what prophets are doing, is they're conveying a message from God. And the connection for why this links up with predicting the future is because, as you know, and as you get into as you know, and as you get into some of the prophetic literature, what the prophets are actually saying in a very simple sense is, if you don't change your ways, destruction is coming. And often they leave off the conditional part of that. They say destruction is coming, and it's implied that you can avoid that by repenting, by changing. But they're talking about the future. Yes, they're very doom and gloom. They're very pessimistic, but it's a future that can be changed. And again, it's a future that relates intimately to the present. All right. To follow through on this, you get other prophets then like Jeremiah, who talks about standing in the divine council, so being there and listening to the debate and hearing, and then going out and proclaiming that message. You have prophets also in the Hebrew Bible who are miracle workers, Elijah and Elisha in particular, who actually reach a point even, and I love this story, these two stories, where you have in 2 Kings 20 or 2:23, this is, this says more about me than it does about Elijah or Elisha rather, but it's my favorite probably story in the Bible, where the Elisha is going through a town of Bethel, and some children come out making fun of him because he's bald-headed, and he curses them in the name of Yahweh, and 2 she-bears come out and maul 42 of the boys. It's just, such a weird story. But the point seems to be, don't mess with prophets, right? Or this other great story, 2 Kings 13, of Elisha actually being long dead, so that his body is deteriorated and all that's left are his bones. But you have another man, a corpse, that touches his bones, and the corpse comes to life. So you get stories like this where prophets, the point is, prophets turn from becoming spokespersons for God to now being really sort of like magical figures, much like early Christian saints who have relics, that can, fragments of their bones or something, that can do great deeds. And finally, some of these stories then lend themselves even into the New Testament. You have, for example, this story of Elisha in 2 Kings 4, who basically multiplies food, very much like what Jesus does in the New Testament, the feeding of the 5,000. So these are, what I guess I'm kind of driving out here is simply to say that these stories, that prophecy goes through itself a kind of a change, a renewal, a reinterpretation, and becomes very rich, both in terms of its roots and what prophets do and in what they become. But for the most part, what prophets do in the literature that we have in the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, prophetic literature, is they are like preachers. They are spokespeople for God. And in some cases, one of the things that I left out is, and one of my favorites is, prophets are also, because of this rich variety, are also often seen and accused of being crazy. That's even a term that's used for them, is that they're a little bit off, because they spend so much time, I guess, communing with, they are touched. And if you remember, that term touched or tetched, if you're from the South, had a particular sense of being, divinely favored, shall we say, and not quite with it. Okay, let me pause or stop there just to open it up for any comments or questions additionally that you may have.
One thing I've always found interesting is that kings seem to be almost required to have a prophet in tow, even when the prophet says very negative things.
Yes, and one of the big issues that's an excellent point, Rick. And just to fill in that that idea or that point just a little bit, kings, yes, did typically have prophets around them, holy men around them, and the reason was because they were, keenly interested in figuring out questions like, do I go to war? How do I respond to this request or whatever? So seeking divine guidance for the decisions they had to make. However, this also raises, and in that story in 1 Kings 22, it becomes the real focus. It also raises a question that was a very big question in ancient Israel, and that is, how do you tell a true prophet from a false prophet? How do you know? And there's really, no foolproof answer given to that question. There are different answers that are suggested, but one of the main ones is you can tell a true prophet because the true prophets are always the ones who are pessimistic. The false prophets are the ones who are optimists, who speak, in glowing terms, whereas the true prophet sees bad news coming. And so that's one of the tests that's sometimes used. And it's used in that story in 1 Kings 22. And the other thing that's even more amazing about that story is that the false prophets in that story don't appear to be making stuff up out of their own will. They have been deceived by God. In that story, they have gotten a false spirit upon them.
Steve, do you know this book, The Secret Chord by Geraldine Brooks?
I don't.
Okay, it's a story of King David, and it gets a little bit into Solomon, but it's told from the point of view of Nathan. And he's he's a prophet in Chronicles. And so I wondered if you could say a word about Nathan. I have no idea, the truth and falsity of the way she's using Nathan as the teller of this story.
Yeah, sure. Nathan's a pretty important figure. He comes up in two contexts in particular. So one of them is in 2 Samuel 11 and 12. Nathan is the prophet who confronts David after his sin with Bathsheba. So Nathan has the distinction of giving the shortest, I guess you could say, oracle or prophecy in the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament. And that is where Nathan tells a story about a man who is poor, and a rich man and poor man living next to each other. And the rich man has many sheep and so on. And the poor man has one little ewe lamb. And the rich man has a visitor come, and he goes next door and steals the poor man's little lamb, who's like a pet, and butchers it and serves it for dinner and so on. And so, Nathan says, what should we do to that man? And David is furious, and he says, he utters his pronouncement, and Nathan says, you are the man, because he stole Bathsheba. Okay. So that's the one story. The other story where Nathan figures prominently is in 1 Kings 1 and 2, where, interestingly enough, Nathan colludes with Bathsheba, the two of them now, to seat Solomon on the throne, as opposed to Solomon's older brother. So that's a very quick sort of overview, but yeah, you could look at those two stories. Yeah.
One of my favorite little oddball quotes from the Bible is the one, the Song of Deborah. Champions were there none in Israel until I, Deborah, arose, a mother in Israel. And that doesn't seem to have any history, except it precedes Jael pounding the peg into Sisera. But anyway, where'd that come from?
Well, that's a great question. So Deborah is a very interesting character because she's a judge and a prophet. She has those two roles. Both of those terms are used for her. And in that passage you're quoting, which is from Judges 5, that is actually one of the oldest, maybe the oldest text in the Bible. It's a poem, a lengthy poem that is referred to as the Song of Deborah. It's credited to her, and so I say oldest or next oldest. It's kind of between Judges 5 and Exodus 15, but those are both very old texts, and they suggest in a text like that the Judges 5 text suggests that women may once have played a much more prominent role in ancient Israel than has kind of come down to us in the stories and later traditions in the Bible, in the Hebrew Bible. So I hope that helps a little bit.
I was going to note that, of course, all these other countries also had their own traditions of divination, and the Romans would look at chickens and stuff. But I was like, well, even today, like, people will go and pray before football games and things. So I guess we still sort of seek the blessings of the deity before we go do something.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And you're right. I mean, a lot of what we know about, a lot of the reason why we can pick out some of the references to divination and some of the things like use of weapons and cups to divine and so on. The reason why we can pick those out is because we have lots of examples of divination and prophecy literature from other civilizations, especially from Mesopotamia, and Egypt. All right, well, very good. We will talk next week about wisdom literature. So a little bit about books like Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and Job.
Thank you so much, Steve.
Thank you.